What's up, everybody? It's Bo here with another X-Men 97 TV talk. And after that first season, if you're like me, you've got one thing on your mind. What's going to happen next in season 2? One way or the other, I think it's safe to say we'll have a lot of different things they'll explore in season 2 beyond just Apocalypse. There are a few different threads that I see out there dangling that they left for all of us as the fans and theorists to begin to tie up in ways that we see them coming together. Namely, there were a lot of references to the Phoenix in the opening credits for this entire season. And with Jean making brief contact with the Phoenix Force at the finale, I mean, you gotta wonder, are we starting to see some sort of reconnection between Jean and the Phoenix? Was this moment, in effect, a way in which the Phoenix is being notified that it's time to come back to Earth to be able to come and pursue Jean for some reason? Obviously, she's in a lot of distress with everything that's happened this past season, and this unintentional calling of the Phoenix Force to come back into Jean, I think, would be very interesting, especially because we got a lot of setup in this season for an Avengers versus X-Men. Now, I've been talking about this throughout this season, but with Captain America coming in and playing a pretty significant cameo role, and a lot of different characters either being seen or alluded to throughout the season, and with the season finale featuring basically an entire panel of Avengers versus X-Men in the midst. I mean, the writing is on the wall. Avengers versus X-Men in X-Men 97, that's happening. Now, whether it happens in season 2 or if it's a setup for season 3, that I don't know. But I do know that all the pieces are there. All the tea leaves are pointing in the direction of an Avengers versus X-Men. Which leads to the question, what will it ultimately be that puts these two teams in direct conflict with each other? If I'm correct, and the Phoenix Force is coming back to Earth, that would align very much with the plotline of Avengers vs. X-Men. The circumstances may not line up perfectly, but at the same time, they could throughout season 2 set things up that puts us in a position where we have essentially like a Krakoa-esque New Genosha being established, and a reason for which the X-Men are facing some kind of post-apocalyptic extinction. One in which the Phoenix Force coming back could be the answer to all of their prayers. And with this cosmic, godlike entity coming to Earth, that's going to be something that's going to alarm a lot of the governments of the world, and thus another call to the Avengers may be required. Now, Steve and Tony, seen here telling the US president that some of their best friends are mutants, totally stood by in the season finale as the United States launched a nuke directly at the X-Men. Like, literally, they did nothing. And with the back and forth that we saw between Rogue and Captain America earlier on in the season, you can see that the tensions are kinda high. The X-Men are not necessarily seen as equals even in the superhero community. Like, I need to go back and rewatch the crossover episode between the Amazing Spider-Man and X-Men from that series. But I even feel like some of Spidey's prejudices were coming out where maybe, he was worried that people would perceive him as a mutant when that's not necessarily the case. I could be mixing up some elements of the comics in there. I don't know. It's been a while. But regardless of what's come before back in the original series, we definitely see all the cookie crumbs are here in this 97 series that sets it up. And I, for one, am absolutely here for it. I want to see these characters go toe-to-toe. Rogue versus the Hulk, or maybe even Captain Marvel, given their actual history in this series, would be very interesting. Storm versus Thor, Cap versus Cyclops, Tony versus Forge. There's just a lot of different things that we could see in a full-on Avengers versus X-Men. And I guess now that I'm even saying all this, I don't want it to happen in season 2. I want it to be season 3 because I want them to have plenty of time for some epic battle sequences. I remember when that story came out in the comics and there was kind of a little bit of a disconnect in that there was being presented this almost pseudo-cinematic experience that was going on in the panels of the comic book pages. And yet I feel like the medium was limiting, given the fact that, especially right now with what we're seeing in some of the battles from season 1, I mean, goodness gracious, could you imagine what it would be like for these two teams to go up against each other and really give some of these one-on-one battles really like full-on episodes or at least half episodes to really give them room to breathe? I just think it'd be outstanding. But given that the season finale has just concluded, the main thing I want to talk about right now is, where's Morph and Wolverine? So the penultimate episode, obviously Wolverine is going through his, invasive surgery? Dude's whole skeleton is getting yanked out by Magneto, and in the process, it almost kills him. Scott is actually at his bedside, basically saying, don't let Jean down. You gotta, live through this. This is what you do. You heal. You're the best there is at what you do, and what you do is heal, but technically what he does isn't very nice, but that's neither here nor there. Either way, he's on the table. Morph is with them. The other X-Men are out dealing with everything that, they're dealing with, and Morph and Wolverine, all season long, something going on there. I mean, like, I'm not the only one who noticed that, right? Like, something kind of seems to be going on there. Now, obviously, X-Men 97 is definitely not shying away from unhealthy relationships, and the concept of a Morph Wolverine relationship would be not great. In the original series, they were very close, they were friends. Wolverine, in particular, is impacted heavily at Morph's supposed death, constantly referring to him as the only one that could make him laugh. There's a bond there, there's a closeness. But romantically, this particular version of Wolverine is still very much pining after Jean. In fact, has been for, 5+ years. And with Morph coming back, if Morph is just kind of transforming into Jean so that they can hook up with Wolverine, I don't know. It almost feels like Wolverine's kind of using his friend to deal with his own stuff. And Morph has been through a lot, okay? Like, they kind of really do them a disservice in this season because so much of Morph's background has to do with Sinister and the torture and abuse and the control that was applied to him. And to have Sinister as such a kind of a major player throughout the season and not lean into the Morph of it all was, I don't know, it just seemed like a huge disservice. Morph's just kind of here, all right? It's like they're just there. But given the fact that at the end of this episode, we know where everybody else is, but we don't know where Morph and Wolverine are, I wonder if we're going to be setting up Morph and Wolverine, be it their two characters or potentially their relationship, I don't know, as kind of a major storyline in season 2. That's just my theory. Where they are in time, who knows? At this moment, my speculation is that they're probably somewhere in the timeline very different from the other two teams. But in terms of those other two teams, we've got Jean and Scott have headed off to the future where they are finding a young version of their son. Now, in the comic books, Jean and Scott actually did get a chance to raise Cable, but they did so under an alias. Now, given the fact that they instantly kind of introduced themselves as Cyclops and Jean, or maybe they said Scott and Jean, I can't exactly remember. I just watched the episode, y'all. But I know they weren't instantly using these aliases, so whether or not they decide to do so is going to be very interesting to see. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, we could very much pick up in season 2 with Jean and Cyclops having kind of this time with Nathan to be his parents, but when it's time to go back to the present, maybe Jean doing a little, snip in his brain, kind of removing those memories or twisting them so that he remembers being raised by this couple for a time, and maybe the names get muddled at that point. I don't know. It'll be very interesting to see, but my guess is that's what we're going to experience with the Jean Grey plotline next season. Or at least in the season opener. I mean, I doubt we're going to get a full season of, them taking him to Montessori school on the moon or wherever they are. But everybody else, they're in the past, and they're chilling out with a young and up-and-coming Apocalypse. That's right. This dude right here. Now, I am very excited for this because this continues something that we've seen throughout 97, and that's closing time loops while also ripping them right back open. It's one of the best things about X-Men 97 is that it's been so good to pick up little threads that were left dangling in the original series and tie them up in a nice little bow, only to snip them and rip them up again. But hey, that's peak X-Men right there. And for me, as someone who admittedly was not a big reader of the comics back in the day, I have often looked to external media to give me the explanation for who Apocalypse is. I remember when he showed up in Evolution. I remember, obviously, when Poe Dameron was Apocalypse and the big purple mean guy. But frankly, I've always wanted more of a deep exploration of who the 90s cartoon series Apocalypse is. For one thing, I trust it more to be true and faithful to the spirit of what was in the source material. But on the other hand, he was such a major player. I mean, Apocalypse shows up within the first, 5 episodes of the first season of X-Men? And at that point, like even Mystique is like his henchwoman. Like, you know what I mean? Like he's got the big bads are already basically serving him. And speaking of Apocalypse, we got the tease that many of us thought was probably coming. It's interesting that the creators of this season talked about how at the time, there was a lot of discussion about who would die in Genosha. Now, that's been presented to us in such a way that they didn't know that Gambit would be the one to be, the big X-Men death. But in all reality, they killed so many people in Genosha, they could technically have been talking about anybody. Look, what X-Men hasn't died and come back to life? But with Gambit specifically, I remember as a kid being told that he became, for a time anyway, one of the Four Horsemen of Apocalypse. In fact, he became Death, taking Angel's place. I've always thought that was wild. I've never actually read that story, and I would love to experience it. As much as I really, I did a whole video on the impact of, losing Gambit and experiencing his death, but I acknowledged even in that we're probably going to see him again in some capacity. If this is it, I'm here for it. Now, my primary focus of that video was specifically on Wolverine and Morph, especially given the fact that we got this major cliffhanger with Wolverine that's just kind of left dangling as he's left to, I don't know, theoretically die. But as many pointed out, those two are not the only ones that are missing. Storm, in fact, is unaccounted for at the end of this season. And so one of the major theories that has been kind of congealing around the fact that we've got these 3 missing X-Men and the big teaser of Apocalypse holding Gambit's card on the very site of his death is leading to this major tease that perhaps we actually can see who the Four Horsemen of Apocalypse will be in season 2. Now, we're dealing with some very interesting things going on, aren't we? We've got the X-Men in the past, the X-Men in the future, as well as Apocalypse himself in the present alongside Bishop and Forge. Now, what I'd like to propose is that perhaps the present that we are experiencing is in fact an alternate present based on the effects of what's going on in the past, and that it will be up to our X-Men in the future to figure this out and bring everyone together to come to some great confrontation that will set things right. A multi-Age of Apocalypse, if you will. And there can be no Age of Apocalypse without his Four Horsemen by his side. And just as we were teased at the end of last season, Gambit will be returning as Death. This is a role that he had in the comics for a time, but he is far from the only X-Men to have been one of Apocalypse's horsemen. Now, what I'm going to lay out here may not align exactly with where these characters were in the Horsemen lineup. And in the case of Morph, I don't think they were ever a Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, but Mystique was, technically, on that one show. I don't know if she was in the comics, but I think she was in Evolution. And they're basically the good guy Mystique. Anyway, point is, here's the lineup. We got Gambit as Death. We got Wolverine as War. Storm as Famine, that's a given. And then Morph as Pestilence. If you think about the way in which their characterizations and their power sets all kind of play into these roles, it just makes sense. Obviously, Gambit is dead. Wolverine, while if I'm not mistaken, he was actually also Death in the comics, facilitating the role of War. I mean, dude's got issues. And not to mention his fault in like all the wars. And with Storm's control of the weather, famine happens in the blink of an eye. And Pestilence and Morph, I mean, okay, that one doesn't make as clear a sense, but it'll work. Like Apocalypse is going to do some sort of crazy stuff to him that'll make it all make sense. It'll make sense. It will. Trust me, it will. That is, of course, if this theory ends up being correct. But honestly, given the fact that these are the X-Men that are currently fully missing, and that we're dealing with Apocalypse, and that these roles of the Four Horsemen are likely to be filled by X-Men, I mean, look, it's a safe bet. But let's keep on adding to this theory. Is this something that you could see happening in season 2? Will this lead to a full resurrection for Gambit? Is Morph being used by a villain to turn against the X-Men kind of repetitive for their character? What role will Wolverine's Berserker mode play into all of this? And with the introduction of T'Challa at the end of last season, could we get Wakanda coming into play? And thus setting up a love triangle between Storm, T'Challa, and Forge. A lot of different things they could do here. Would love to hear your thoughts. Put it in the comments. Let's talk about it.